Hello viewers, and welcome to another one of Thrilling Duck's extremely sporadically released and randomly topicked videos. When will the next one be released? What will it be about? Even I don't know, but let's jump right in. Today I want to try something a little different from my usual MO. I'm going to talk about a series that is near and dear to me despite not being narratively oriented like the games I usually talk about on this channel. This is basically going to be something of an extremely light retrospective with a little more attention paid to gameplay than usual, but an emphasis on my personal opinions and feelings on each of the games in question. As I'm sure you can tell from the title of this video, I harbor a number of sentiments that don't seem to be shared by the Star Fox fanbase at large, but let's talk about it. First up to bat is what in-universe canon refers to as the Lylat Wars, and this encompasses the original Star Fox on the SNES, Star Fox 64, and Star Fox 64 3D, because they are, for all intents and purposes, the same game, and certainly the same story. I'll talk about Star Fox Zero later on as well, but it's more of a reimagining than a remake, even though it still tells the Lylat Wars story yet again. I want to put it in its own section for other reasons. But anyway, starting off with a banger, controversial opinion number 1. Star Fox 64 is one of the most overrated games of all time. Okay, but before you flame me alive, just let me clarify. I do not think that 64 is a bad game. I think it's a very good game. It's simple fun, it can be somewhat addicting, and it's brief and easy to replay. But the way people talk about this thing, you'd think the cartridge was like carved from the wood of the True Cross or something. I've never understood the sheer unreal amount of praise that gets levied at it constantly in other reviews and retrospectives. Now, in fairness, I actually don't have any nostalgia towards this most seminal entry in the series. While I have taken a fairly passionate liking to the Star Fox series at large over the years, I actually didn't play the Lylat Wars until their 3DS makeover, and even then, I wasn't utterly blown away the way I was expecting to be based on the pedestal that 64 is always held up on. I want you to understand why, though, so I'm going to break down the points of praise I usually see thrown at the game, and then explain why they just don't fill me with the same sense of gaming euphoria they seem to fill everyone else with. First off, let's talk about the branching paths. Everyone says how great the branching paths are, and how much sheer replayability they add. Star Fox 64 has like 25 possible routes you can take. Oh my god, so replayable! Now, I'll admit that they're a nice touch, and I'm sure they were quite novel at the time of the game's initial release, but this notion that all the stage sequence combinations are so mind-numbingly amazing and add so much to the game's longevity seem really silly and overblown to me. The reality is that there are 3 major paths, an easy, medium, and hard one. You can cross between them within a run by fulfilling or failing certain optional objectives, but the larger combination of potential sequences this adds is pretty immaterial because it's really just 3 distinct sets of levels. To be fair, even disregarding the larger amount of possible route combinations, those 3 paths are certainly nothing to sneeze at, but I also think they're something of a product of their time. Now, this is absolutely a matter of personal taste, but I for one would have much preferred to just have one path that all the stages were easily accessible along, and then have the game tell a more coherent, direct story. Yes, this layout would cut down on the game's quote-unquote replayability by traditional standards, but even a single route in Star Fox 64, as is, can easily clock in at under an hour. Add up all 3 major routes and the game is roughly 3 hours, and if you're one of those people who replays it over and over and knows it like the back of your hand, then I imagine that's probably being a bit generous. 3 hours is not a long game. By modern standards, it would be downright unacceptable, and indeed, when Star Fox Zero released at full price, it was. The point I'm trying to make here, though, is that I don't think a more straightforward 3-hour game would really lose anything that playing variations of a 1-hour game 3 times in a row gives you. And honestly, I think the game would be better for it because of my second major point, that being the way you find new levels. This is another area in which fans often seem to like piling on the praise for 64 that has just never quite clicked with me. Maybe this is something that had more appeal in the days before the internet was what it was now, and I can imagine that trading rumors and information in the schoolyard could have added an intangible sense of enjoyment to this process, but I have never been a fan of games cryptically hiding content behind arbitrary tasks, and this is the primary way that Star Fox 64 likes to separate its level paths. In my opinion, the best that a concept like this gets is when it at least follows internal logic, like Slippy getting shot down, leading to the team making a detour on a nearby planet. This still isn't totally ideal, because for 99% of the game, letting Slippy get shot down does nothing but inconvenience you, and there's certainly nothing about the boss fight where this route opens up that overtly clues you into what you need to do to access it. Hitting all the train switches on Macbeth to kill the boss early doesn't really do much to justify a completely alternate route through space, but it's at least one of few examples where a sub-objective is clearly indicated to the player. More often than not, though, is the worst-case scenario, where a path is opened by performing a completely arbitrary task that's not indicated to you at all. And there's a further stipulation, such as flying under a few land formations, or shooting every one of a specific set of targets while Falco is alive, leading to him just randomly leading you elsewhere and opening up another level. The latter example, at least, is a test of player skill, but it's still too cryptic to be gating level content behind, in my opinion. Anyway, the point is that I think there was a better way to structure the level progression in Star Fox 64 that would have allowed Nintendo to expand on the characters and narrative a bit more and ensure that most players see every level at the time of the game's release, when you couldn't just look this shit up online, and nothing of value would have been sacrificed in the process. True replayability is just your own desire to replay a game, and that stems primarily from enjoyment. I, for one, would much rather replay a 3-hour game with a proper through line than a 1-hour game 3 times in a row, but hey, maybe that's just me. I will say, though, that my time with the 3DS remake was initially just spent going online to look up the level unlocking stipulations, and now that I've unlocked all of them once, I don't actually replay proper runs of the story anymore. When I revisit it, I just hop into the stage select and play through every level in sequence, and since there's no worthwhile story developments between missions anyway, and the character's banter is still on for stages accessed through the score attack, I still feel like I get the full experience, and perhaps even an outright improved one. Again, please don't mistake this for me shitting on Star Fox 64. It's still a solid, enjoyable game, and I myself think it is laudable that it even allows me to curate my own experience with it on repeat visits like I just indicated. And I will admit that the moment-to-moment gameplay probably does have the best game feel in the series. I just don't think it's the goddamn second coming is all. And frankly, it's easily my least favorite of its series-defining N64 contemporaries of the Mario and Zelda families, though to be fair, part of that does come down to genre preference. Taken on its own, though, I honestly just don't find a pure arcade-style shooter with limited narrative hook to be that evergreenly compelling anyway. But like with many first-party Nintendo properties, there's just something about the characters, world, and atmosphere that elevates the game and indeed series to a whole greater than the sum of its parts for me, which is a large part of why I'm taking the time to talk about it at all. Next in line, however, is the often maligned Star Fox Adventures, and surprise, surprise, controversial opinion number 2 is that I personally happen to love Star Fox Adventures. Again, however, some context is in order, and I'm certainly going to acknowledge Adventure's faults, both in terms of its own merits and the circumstances of its existence. The first thing you need to know about Star Fox Adventures is that it's the first Star Fox game I ever played. The second thing is that the Zelda-like action-adventure genre is my overall favorite genre in gaming. You put these two pieces of information together, and I think you can at least see where I'm coming from. Obviously, there is some bias here, and obviously I'm an exceptional case. One might even argue I represent the teeny tiny fraction of now Star Fox fans who this game was most liable to actually appeal to, and I acknowledge this. It certainly has an insurmountable advantage over 64 in gaining my favor, between its nostalgic value to me personally and my preference for its mechanical genre. All that being said, however, this is a game that I absolutely feel gets shit on unfairly. While Adventures definitely has some pretty glaring flaws in its world structure, its combat and aiming mechanics are completely broken, and elements of its lore really don't seem to fit into the science fiction universe of Star Fox all that well, I still find it to be a fun and immersive experience that I enjoy revisiting periodically to this day. Its graphical fidelity and atmosphere are frankly off the charts for a game of its generation, and as a kid I was beyond enamored with the way its Zelda-like design combined with the science fiction aesthetic of the Star Fox universe. I also think Fox and his crew were integrated extremely well considering the fact that they weren't even supposed to be here, and the way the narrative does insert them makes total sense and is deserving of praise. Seeing a broke Star Fox team in a dilapidated Great Fox in need of whatever mercenary work they can get makes for a neat setup, and watching the crew bounce off each other in the opening is a treat, even if a simple one. Falco, having gone solo during a time when they hadn't seen any aviation action for years, makes perfect sense for his character, in my opinion, and the context of his return, though admittedly out of nowhere, made for a really hype moment. Andros was shoehorned in, sure, but they at least vaguely indicated how he was able to return, even if they didn't build it up at all. Now, to be clear, I'm not holding any single entry in this series to the narrative standards that I would hold a Kingdom Hearts game, or any sort of RPG for that matter. While I am a fan of storytelling in the gaming medium, and I always enjoy a good, well-told story with likable characters, regardless of genre, I acknowledge that expectations for narrative caliber in this industry change between genre and developer. If I'm looking at a Nintendo IP in a non-RPG, then yeah, I'm gonna go a little easier on it, because holding a game like that to the storytelling standards of a series like Final Fantasy is like asking an infant to take part in the Olympics. Let's just be real here. Having said that, Star Fox Adventures is, well, an adventure game, and the standards for storytelling in that genre are definitely a little bit higher than those of the arcade space shooter. All the same, I'm a little baffled that all the same people who consider any aspect of Star Fox 64 to be rich storytelling and consider Bill and Kat to be great characters seriously take issue with Falco's sudden return and Andros' somewhat haphazard integration. I agree that General Scales being robbed of an actual boss fight was ridiculous and totally ill-conceived, but the rest? I'll give it a pass under the circumstances. Plus, Fox and the R-Wing just look so great in this game, come on. I also think that Crystal was a worthwhile addition to the cast in the long run, even if she doesn't really get to come into her own until Assault. And speaking of which, let's talk about Assault. Controversial opinion number 3. Star Fox Assault is my overall favorite entry in the series. I'm sorry, but this game is everything I would have wanted 64 to be. Now, I understand that a lot of people strongly dislike the ratio of ground to air combat in Assault, and I sympathize. The 3 on-rails R-Wing levels are definitely the gameplay highlights of the experience, but since I'm not a giant fan of 64 anyway, and the on-rails arcade space shooting gets a little stale after less than 3 hours for me personally, to be brutally honest, I find that Assault has just the right amount of gameplay variety and narrative depth to keep me engaged from start to finish. The game is definitely longer than a single run of 64, but it's still extremely short overall, which makes it very easy to just pick up and replay once or twice a year. The narrative and character portrayal and development are leagues more advanced than anything 64 has to offer, while still bearing that elegant Nintendo charm and simplicity. Old characters are fleshed out even further, and a few new characters are introduced as well. I'm gonna focus on Assault a bit more than the previous 2 games because I have a bit more to say in its favor that most people either don't agree with or don't even acknowledge. First of all, let's tackle the issue of character redesigns. This is something that drives me a little crazy when people complain about it because my threshold for what even qualifies as a quote-unquote redesign, as opposed to simply a modernization or update, is clearly less sensitive than most other fans. Crash Twinsanity is a great example of this. I have seen people seriously complain about Assault's redesigns, and more often than not, my thoughts are just like, what are you even talking about? The main Star Fox crew have new outfits, but they're clearly the same characters, maybe just drawn a little differently. General Pepper probably has the most drastic design change, but he's also supposed to be a fair bit older at this point, and I think his new look suits him quite well. Wolf and his current and former crew are just improved across the board in my opinion, and so I want to take a closer look at them too. However, let's start with a quick look at the character development that Fox and his team undergo in this entry. Fox McCloud is not the same brash, cocky youth he was back during the Lilac Wars. This version of Fox is much more soft-spoken, earnest, and caring. He's already defeated Andros, his father's killer, and so he doesn't have that chip on his shoulder anymore. He's really grown into his role as the team's leader, and while I can understand complaints that he comes across a bit more vanilla than his 64 counterpart, I think his more mature persona really suits him and serves as a good subtle storytelling sort of indicator of how far into his career this game takes place. And the same goes for the rest of the team's veteran players. Falco Lombardi has grown from the cocky flyboy with way too much to prove and no respect for his squad leader into a staunch, dependable, best friend, right-hand man type. He's still the team's ace pilot, and he's still very confident in his skills, and perhaps even a bit arrogant as well, but he isn't the same snot-nosed, insufferable asshole that he was during 64, and this too, I think, really suits him and makes sense given his age and appearance. He's dependable, but not cocky, tough, but not abrasive, cool, but not a jerk. Slippy Toad is no exception either. He's still slippy, he still can't get bogeys off his tail, and he's still the team's mechanic who mostly hops in an R-Wing to fill out their ranks, but he's clearly gained more confidence in himself over the years, and openly stands up for himself on the now rare occasion when Falco tries lightly bullying him a bit. He's come a long way. Peppy Hare has finally retired from the Arwing's cockpit to take on a supporting role alongside Rob 64 in the Grey Fox. He's probably the most similar overall to his 64 incarnation, being the wise mentor figure, but this makes sense because he was already older back then to begin with. A seasoned veteran whose angsty youth has been behind him for as long as we've known him doesn't need to change in any significant way within the time span between 64 and Assault. And lastly, we come to Crystal, who is now a full-fledged member of the Star Fox team and replaces Peppy as a pilot. While there was definitely a certain charm to Fox and his boys earlier in the series, I for one like that the team is no longer a complete sausage fest. Crystal adds some of her distinct feminine charm to the team's dynamic, and her gentle nature and status as the resident telepath lends her a sense of identity all her own that freshens things up and definitely doesn't lump her in as a diet Peppy. Her small, periodic insights into the Apparoid's brainwaves are a nice touch as well. As for Starwolf, what can I say? These guys have never been cooler before or since. If you seriously prefer Wolf's eye patch to his electronic eye, then I mean okay, but I personally feel that everything surrounding his relatively light redesign is an improvement. His character development as well, from purely evil rival mercenary to an almost pseudo-mentor bully of a big brother with a begrudging respect for Fox, is just rad as hell. Leon is the only former member still in his employ, but Panther Caruso is a great newcomer, with a personality that contrasts his teammates very nicely, and also sets him apart from the former Starwolf members that he's replacing. I do wish that there was a second newcomer as well, because it seems silly that Starwolf no longer perfectly mirrors Star Fox as they once did, and the heroes now outnumber them, which makes them a little less intimidating. But this is a nitpick in the scheme of things. I just think it's a really dumb omission. Having said that, I absolutely love Andrew Oikony and Pigma Dengar's new roles. Andrew is Andross's nephew, and he loved waving that in your face back in 64, so it makes complete sense that he would continue to live in his uncle's shadow even after Andross's passing, and I think that his role as the way less charismatic or intimidating de facto leader of the remnants of the Benomian army was a great choice. He may only appear in the opening stage, but his one appearance and try-hard emulation of Andross's style were both effective and memorable. Pigma, on the other hand, is also incredibly well utilized. He was always a real swine, pardon the pun, and it couldn't be more logical that the man who betrayed James McCloud and the original Team Star Fox would in time defect from Starwolf as well, when he felt he could make a bigger buck flying solo. The plot arc with him and the Apparoid's core memory was engaging all the way through, had a great climax, and ended with him finally getting his just desserts, after having his crimes go relatively unpunished all these years. Another great use of a returning character in a new context. I also just want to briefly call attention to Assault's finale, which I feel people kind of blow past due to their lukewarm feelings for the game in general, despite it being pretty brilliant overall. Ironically, despite the fact that Andross is an actual character, I kind of found the Apparoids to have more personality than him in a weird way. Yes, they're a hive mind and don't generally speak, but on the rare occasions when they do speak through a host, I find them to be wonderfully unsettling. Hearing them wrestle Pigma's free will away from him is pretty cool, and the Apparoid Queen's own voice right before the final battle is delightfully chilling. The most noteworthy moment of the game's climax, in my opinion, however, is the Queen's telepathic projection of James McCloud into Fox's mind. This moment is effectively a dark reflection of Star Fox 64's true ending, where instead of James's spirit actually showing up of its own volition and spurring Fox on with words of faith and encouragement, his spirit is instead invoked artificially by a malevolent force and used to encourage Fox to back down and surrender. The way Fox then turns this assault on his psyche around by realizing that his father would never say something like this is just an insanely badass moment of subtle storytelling, since most people who played Assault probably grew up with 64 and experienced Fox's image of his father many, many times. In that way, the player is put in Fox's position even more than usual, and I just think the poetry of the moment as a sort of warped echo of 64's finale is really, really cool. Now let's talk about controversial opinion number 4. Star Fox Assault has the best voice acting in the entire series. I'm sorry, but this preference for the original voice cast of 64 will never be anything more than nostalgia goggle-driven rubbish to me. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion, of course, and I'll grant that their cheesy deliveries served the cheesy dialogue of 64 well enough, but anyone who seriously thinks that the voice acting in Assault is outright worse just because it's different seriously needs to get their ears checked and their taste evaluated. Fox's performance is great in my opinion, and absolutely suits the spirit of his character as he appears in this game to a T. If you prefer the scrappy, "we prefer to do things our way, General," Fox to this more noble and mature one, then that's your prerogative, but don't go telling me that the new actor is worse, because I don't buy it. Falco's VA captures both the spirit of old and new Falco, and you cannot tell me that Slippy's new voice isn't an improvement over the old high-pitched girl voice. I'm sorry. Crystal sounds great, and Peppy and Pepper's VAs capture their character's essence phenomenally. Now let's talk about Starwolf again real quick, and fair warning, this is about to get inflammatory. I'm sorry, but British Starwolf has never done it for me. That was always ridiculous and did not suit the characters at all, in my opinion. Assault Starwolf is an across-the-board improvement, and frankly, they should have been like this to begin with. They're tough, they're grizzled, and they're dangerous. They're not flamboyant Bond villains. I'm reasonably certain that the only reason they sounded that way back in 64 was because the standards for voice direction back then were garbage, and the only direction the actors were given was like, I don't know, they're evil or something. And it was the 90s, so the American VAs heard the word evil and were just like, okay, I guess British then. Look at Leon's design. Look at his key art for Assault. He's a sleazy-looking, hunched-over lizard doing weird Master Xehanort shit with his fingers, and his voice in Assault reflects that way better than some stupid generic 80s Bond villain voice. Say what you will, but I am convinced that if the roles had been reversed, and the Assault VAs had been the originals, and the 64 VAs with their ridiculous British accents had replaced them, then people would be shitting on that cast left and right. Assault had the better voice cast across the board by far, and I just wish people would stop clinging so insistently to the guys from 64 just because they got a little luckier with their casting back in the fucking 90s. Guys, not all change is bad. Hell, people complain about the voice deliveries in Star Fox Zero, and those are largely the same actors. If that's not proof that you're just irrationally attached to the exact audio that you grew up with, then I don't know what is. Okay. Now that I'm done chasing away what few subscribers I had, as well as everyone watching this video, let's move on to Star Fox Command. Controversial opinion number 5. Command is super fun, definitely one of my favorite entries in the series, and a total guilty pleasure of mine. So let's talk about it. Star Fox Command gets a bad rep for 3 major reasons. 1 is that there's no on-rails gameplay. 2 is that it's rather repetitive. 3 is that the branching story, and particularly the cringy endings, are all over the place. These are all fair points, and I acknowledge that Command is a deeply flawed game. But for some sick reason, I legitimately enjoy it more than 64. Yes, more than 64, and I'm going to try and explain why. The first reason ultimately, again, just boils down to an issue of personal taste. Although the levels in Star Fox 64 are definitely aesthetically distinct and have a few differing and memorable set pieces, I've just never been overly enthralled with that game. I don't know. The pure, undiluted arcade space shooting just doesn't do it for me for some reason. In light of this, similar to Star Fox Assault, Command's sprinkling of just enough gameplay variety just appeals to me more. Yes, all the flight combat is in similarly structured all-range mode arenas, but there's plenty of enemy variety, and they're interspersed with the strategic gameplay on the level maps, which add variety, flavor, specific context, and tactical intention to each encounter. The all-range mode combat itself is just the actual engagement, the test of skill and dexterity. And frankly, I find Command's combat to be less repetitive than 64's for one simple reason: the multiple distinct playable characters. Now right off the bat, let me say that I've observed 2 major sources of design philosophy that games of various real-time action genres employ to generate their particular brand of fun: character abilities and level design. Unfortunately, I find that many incredibly amazing games still only focus on one or the other. It's extremely rare to find a game that focuses on both. Metroidvanias, for example, focus on character abilities. The Caverns of Zebes are aesthetically appealing enough, but Metroid is hardly a platformer, and you're not going to be challenged simply navigating the level geometry. Metroid is fun because of what Samus can do, and I would echo these sentiments for Dracula's Castle and Alucard in Castlevania Symphony of the Night. On the other side of the spectrum, we have games whose design brilliance stems just about solely from the level design. All 5 mainline Donkey Kong Country games are goddamn masterpieces of the 2D platforming genre, but you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who thinks Donkey Kong himself is what makes those games fun. He can hardly do jack shit on his own, and even with an ally, all he can really do is take a couple extra hits and maybe extend his jump a bit for the most part. I know that all the DKC games are a little different, but you get the idea. People like to play Donkey Kong Country. People like to play as Samus Aran. It is extremely rare that you find a game that nails both level design and character abilities, and that's why games like Banjo-Kazooie and Shovel Knight are such enduring classics. The point I'm making is that while I am a fan of each of those design philosophies and can certainly appreciate both, I have always had a bit of a preference for the character abilities-oriented approach when forced to choose between the two. I love DKC, but I will always prefer Metroid at the end of the day. That's just how I am. For this reason, Command's design philosophy actually offers a somewhat more worthwhile sense of variety than 64 does to me, despite the relative simplicity of its arenas. Star Fox 64 has some variance in its level design, but you're always playing as Fox in the same simple R-Wing, laser power-ups or not. There's nothing wrong with that, and the game is clearly designed around it, but it's one of the things that causes it to appeal to me a little less for whatever reason. Star Fox Command, on the other hand, has a plethora of distinct playable characters. The pilots look unique, and their ships are both aesthetically and mechanically distinct, with different stats and weapon types. In total, Command has about 16 playable characters, and of those 16, only one pilot is repeated in a slightly different form, that being Crystal, and only 2 pairs have similar vehicles, those being Cornerian Crystal and Bill Gray, and Peppy Hare and motherfucking James McCloud. Every single one of them has a unique music track that accompanies their combat skirmishes as well, and although they vary in quality, it's a nice touch. Combine all that with the strategic map gameplay and the aesthetic variety offered by the all-range mode arenas still taking place across most of the series' classic planets and space sectors, and I honestly find Command to be way more addicting to my sensibilities than 64. I realize that I'm completely alone in this, and that's okay. I just wanted to express it. Additionally, however, I want to tackle Command's storytelling, because while it is bad, I really don't think it's all bad, and it certainly deserves credit for having a little goddamn ambition, which is more than I can say of Star Fox Zero. I'll start by addressing the elephant in the room, which is the various endings. There's no sugarcoating this, most of these are terrible. The endings themselves are by far the worst part of any playthrough story. They're not just weird, cringy, officialized fanfiction, but many of them come out of nowhere and don't bear any actual relation to what you did along the way, which is in my opinion their worst offense. There are a few tolerable ones, and honestly I think the one where the team's kids grow up to replace them with Falco taking on Peppy's role is actually kind of a wholesome place for the original canon to potentially end, since it seems to have been dropped rather unceremoniously. But I can also acknowledge just how sudden and fanficky it comes across. The Starwolf ending is conceptually kind of fun in my opinion, barring the ridiculous cursed bounty hunter bullshit at the end of it. And the one where Falco starts his own team is a fun idea, even if the motivation of it being that he missed out on the final battle due to literally not paying attention and just fucking off for no reason is mind-numbingly stupid. The one where Dash becomes Andross' successor comes out of nowhere for him as a character, who is nothing but friendly and pleasant, and receives no personal development whatsoever during the actual game, but as a non-canon evil ending, it's neat that the game lets you play as Andross' grandson and gives him a mustache-twirling ending. The one where Slippy gets married and has like 10 kids is just weird though, and the one where Fox starts G-Zero racing to combat his crippling depression after being left by Crystal is just ridiculous and unbearable, the rare nod to F-Zero's existence notwithstanding. I'm gonna talk about the default ending in a bit more detail shortly, but I think the best and arguably intended canon ending is the one which the game dubs Ending Number 1, which is essentially everything the default ending should have been, as it involves the team completing their mission and reuniting for good, while recruiting a new member into their ranks and even setting the stage for a potential future conflict without robbing the current victory of all its validity. The actual story routes themselves, though, are a bit more of a mixed bag in terms of levels of interest and cohesion. The real issue here is that Command suffers from Shadow the Hedgehog syndrome, in that there is very little logic in the way your between-chapter choices affect where you go and who you meet. Shadow the Hedgehog, at least, was very straightforward about how to reach each stage and ending along its branching path, even though this resulted in an extremely arbitrary sense of narrative progression. Command, unfortunately, doesn't fare much better in its narrative progression, though there are a few exceptions, and doesn't have the benefit of plot navigation simplicity on its side either. If you want to experience every level and get every ending, then you basically need this very handy guide that you can easily find on Google Images. It's essentially a tree diagram of the game's much more convoluted branching paths, many of which offer multiple routes to certain levels and endings, but only one route to others. Overall, I find the default route, the one which the game locks you into on a first playthrough, to be the most enjoyable one. This route really just feels like a solid, fun little sequel to Assault until the ending itself. The premise is that Star Fox disbanded a few years ago due to a series of stupid decisions that Fox made. The exact reasoning is a bit inconsistent and not particularly well thought out, but again, this is Star Fox, not Kingdom Hearts, so I'll give the details a pass since they're really just an excuse to go on a fun, breezy, getting the band back together style adventure when the Lilat system faces a new threat in the form of the Angler Empire. Along this route, you re-recruit Slippy, Falco, and Crystal, in that order, but also have brief stints with newcomers Amanda and Lucy along the way. Amanda is Slippy's fiancée, which, I mean, good for him, and Lucy is Peppy's daughter. I just mention this because even these newcomers have an overt connection to other classic characters. Everyone has a unique ship with a design that reflects them, of course, and even their cockpit radars look different, which is a nice touch. Fox rocks the classic R-Wing, Slippy's Bullfrog is wide and squat like him, Falco's Skyclaw has actual falcon wings, Amanda's Tadpole literally looks like a tadpole, and Lucy's Sky Bunny has bunny ears. We also get to see both flavors of Crystal on this route, since when you first find her in the middle of a mission, she's donning a helmet and piloting a standard-issue Cornerian fighter, but once she's rejoined you properly, she removes the helmet and pilots her signature Cloud Runner, both named and designed to resemble the pterodactyl race from planet Sauria, which is just a cool bit of Adventure's fan service. During the journey, we also see what some old fan favorites are up to. Peppy has replaced Pepper as the Cornerian general, which makes sense and was even hinted at in Assault, so that's some nice continuity from the previous entry. We also have a brief run-in with Starwolf and Oikony as well. Wolf just attacks Fox for old time's sake, and Oikony is working for the Angler. I think Oikony's justification is better, since Wolf essentially loses all his character development from Assault, but interestingly he acts more like post-Assault Wolf on other routes, so this is just kind of an outlier for the sake of having a Starwolf boss fight in the default route. Anyway, the run caps off with a showdown with the Angler Emperor, who is the proper main antagonist of the game. I mention that because it's a point about the default route's flavor, since not every route actually caps off with this guy. All in all, the default route has adequate continuity and serves as a simple but damn decent follow-up to Assault. Really, my only problem with it is the shitty ending, which starts out as a generic hooray the team reunited and defeated the bad guy, only to pull a total 180 and say, but then Crystal left Fox and ran off with Panther anyway, and Fox was miserable and alone forever, which is just fucking tasteless and didn't seem to serve any purpose other than to encourage players to play alternate routes, which really wasn't necessary. If I'm enjoying the game, then the promise of discovering more levels and playable characters and stories is more than enough to get me to explore the other routes. You don't need to force a shitty outcome into a decent ending. And it's a shame too, because I think these endings soured a lot of people who by all rights could have gotten the most out of this entry that they had since Star Fox 64, what with its surprisingly comparable design structure. Because similar to 64, Command is really built around relatively quick, bite-sized, arcade-style runs of its campaign. Command definitely has more sheer longevity than 64 thanks to the strategy aspects of its gameplay and the larger number of levels and endings to collect, but individual runs only last about an hour or two, which for my tastes and purposes actually leads me to pop this game in for a quick run or two the way most normal people do with 64. And an even further parallel to 64, any stages and accompanying characters you do find along any given run are saved into the game's stage select, so players have the option to replay favorite levels or characters without having to grind all the way through a whole run to reach them again, or worse still, actually remember the route they took to get there in the first place. And if you do actually like the gameplay but have no love whatsoever for the story, then every cutscene can be skipped, even the first time through, and the stage select will allow you to ultimately play every level in the game back-to-back with no story whatsoever, should you desire such a thing. Or just curate your own route based on preferred levels and characters alone, whatever. Command gives you options to enjoy the game on your own terms, much like 64 does, and I just don't think it gets enough praise for that. Anyway, I'm not going to go in-depth into every stage and route, but I will say that I personally found the variety to be extremely enjoyable, even if the plotlines themselves had very little logic or cohesion outside of the default one. Different routes feature different bosses, and you can play as Bill and Kat from 64. Kat, as a side note, has an actual redesign. I'm fine with it, but I acknowledge that this is a redesign and not just an update. Her fur is black instead of pink, and she just looks actually completely different. But I digress. Dash is interesting again just because he's related to Andross, and some routes even put Peppy in the party, allowing you to play with the classic original Team Star Fox. It's worth noting, however, in an extremely annoying wrinkle, that even though Peppy is playable in this game, if you actively follow dialogue options that focus on seeking him out, none of them will result in a route where you actually get to play as him, which is another example of the route logic being incredibly stupid and arbitrary at times. Again, bring a guide. But yeah, Pigma's ghost is a boss in a couple of routes, Andross's ghost appears in a couple of routes. These are silly but fun inclusions, and Andross's legacy is actually pretty well utilized, as the team uses an old invention of his to access the Venom C for the final showdown in some storylines. This is the only major beat I feel was missing from the default route, as the Arwing's inability to function in the caustic Venom C is a plot point, but instead of resolving it and taking the fight to the Angler, the default route just has them take the fight to you in space and seal their own destruction that way. Some routes do this sloppy thing where the story will shift away from Fox to follow someone else, but because Rob and the Great Fox are a central game mechanic, they will go along with that other character for basically no reason, leading from bizarre situations where it accompanies Slippy or Falco by themselves to downright nonsensical ones where it just accompanies Starwolf. Although that last point leads me to one more little gush before we move on from this game. In a series first and last, all 3 pilots from Starwolf can be counted among Command's list of playable characters, and they're all super powerful and fun to use. Leon's Rainbow Delta and Panther's Black Rose each have a weapon type that's totally unique to them and not used by anyone else in the game. And Wolf's Wolfen has probably the best overall stats and most powerful but balanced weapons of the entire cast. All 3 are just an absolute treat, and outside the default route, Wolf acts a little bit more the way you'd expect him to after the events of Assault, although not perfectly on point. Now before we wrap up here, I have to acknowledge that even for me, the gameplay of Command is far from perfect. Taking down missiles can be extremely difficult and stressful depending on the character, and the game's obsession with using these beacons to create an instant fail state is really obnoxious. They're not that hard, and you will succeed with minimal effort about 98% of the time, but that 2% is out there, and it is insanely frustrating when it happens. Now, I can't be 100% sure, but I did feel like the missile's beacons are farther apart and thus harder to nail the farther it is from the Great Fox. So if that was indeed a recurring pattern and not mere happenstance on my playthroughs, then the fact that they're easier to down when they're closer to instantly failing you is a merciful touch. Less merciful are these mini-bosses that show up in enemy bases in the final level or 2 of some routes, which are just insanely tedious to kill for basically every single character, and God forbid you actually screw up the instant fail beacon thing when it's done and have to redo the whole damn thing. That actually happened to me once and I was absolutely livid. Having said all that though, the simple and somewhat repetitive all-range only action has never been a hindrance to my enjoyment of Command, personally speaking anyway. The mix of old and new mechanics just appeal to me in a way 64 never did for whatever reason. Peppy's famous line may not be here, but Command makes the most intense use of the barrel roll as a core mechanic by far, and honestly I think even the unique way smart bombs work in this title makes them the most fun and satisfying to use out of any game in the entire series. All I'm saying is, if you're a big fan of 64 who firmly believes that Fox should never leave his R-Wing and hasn't given Command a shot yet, then honestly, I say go for it. Even if it doesn't overtake 64 for you, it's a lot more fun than people give it credit for. And who knows, it might just sink its teeth into you in a different way. And so, to conclude this little retrospective of the Star Fox series, I have one last controversial opinion for you all. This one is probably the least controversial of the bunch in all honesty, but I still don't see it talked about all that much online. While I am not much of a fan of Star Fox Zero, controversial opinion number 6 is that the controls aren't what I hate most about it, or feel makes it less compelling than other entries. The thing that destroyed Zero for me right out of the gate was its premise. The individual entries of this franchise actually have canonized names to reference the events that occur within them. The original title on the SNES, Star Fox 64, and 64's 3DS remake all tell a story that is known as the Lilat Wars. The events of Star Fox Adventures are referred to in-universe as the Saurian Crisis. The events of Star Fox Assault are called the Apparoid Invasion, and even silly, branching, barely canon Command has a recurring through line known as the Angler Offensive. Once upon a time, Star Fox told new stories. Many of them were simple, and they didn't always make complete sense. But for God's sake, they tried to tell new stories. They had a modicum of narrative creativity, and even a surprising amount of character development. The Angler Offensive, which is the latest tale to date, chronologically speaking, was given to us in 2006. From that point, it took half a decade to receive Star Fox 64 3D, which was the third time that we were given the Lilat Wars. Yet another half a decade later, Star Fox Zero came out, which was yet again just the goddamn Lilat Wars being shoved down our throats. To put this in perspective, we received Star Fox Zero before the long-dormant and frankly dated on arrival Star Fox 2 made its way into general consumer hands. This means that including all remakes, at the time of Zero's release, the series had a total of 7 games. Of those 7 games, 4 of them, more than half, were just telling the same fucking Lilat Wars story. When Star Fox Zero was on the horizon, and all we knew about it was that the Wii U was finally getting a new Star Fox game, I was so friggin' excited. When the Muppet-style puppet sketch began at E3 2015, I was on the edge of my seat, hyped to all hell. Finally! After a literal decade, we were getting a new Star Fox game. And as the curtain rose and I saw that it was just yet another reimagining of 64, yet another remake of the original SNES game, I didn't even need to see the shitty gamepad gimmick to know that I wasn't picking that lazy garbage up until I found it used in a bargain bin years later. It wasn't a new game. It was just Lilat Wars again. Controversial opinion number 6, I am so sick and tired of the goddamn Lilat Wars. And then, like a bolt from the blue, we received a ray of hope from an unexpected source. Starlink, the Battle for Atlas, is not a Star Fox game. However, it showed us that Nintendo would still allow other developers to work with the IP, and unlike Star Fox Adventures, this felt like a game that Fox and his merry band actually belonged in. They may be merely guests, but they were integrated in phenomenally well. They feel like themselves, or at least a sort of halfway point between their 64 and Assault incarnations, since Fox is a little less scrappy and Falco is less of a douchebag. The main story doesn't belong to them, but they're still active participants, and they have a side story dedicated entirely to them. And if anything, the fact that it takes place outside the Lilat system is nothing but a positive service to their adventure, since it effectively forces them to leave the Lilat Wars behind. The gameplay is entirely vehicle-based and features both space and planet-side combat. There may not be any on-rails arcade shooting, but the free-roam open world is far more expansive and visually stimulating than any all-range mode sequence in series history. The galaxy is vast, the planets are lush, and the moment-to-moment gameplay is consistent and doesn't force any alternate gameplay styles onto you. It combines the high-octane dogfights of 64 with the planet-side exploration of Adventures. It combines the free weapon-switching ground and aerial combat of Assault with the character and vehicle switching of Command, and even the macro strategy elements of Command and Star Fox 2. Hell, I'll even throw the HD graphics in and say that's from Star Fox Zero. Why not? And all of this wrapped up in a simple, but for the love of God, actually brand new story with both new and returning characters. And to think this came out of stupid Ubisoft. I hate Ubisoft! Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Starlink is flawless, because it isn't. Although there is a very commendable variety of activities to engage in, especially post-DLC, its overall structure can be somewhat repetitive once it is revealed to you. And unlike with entries such as Star Fox 2 and Command, I think this is an area where the game's sheer scale can actually become more of a hindrance than an asset. That being said, I will never insult a game for having ambition in its scope or narrative. And although I don't feel that the game's original characters ever really measure up to the Star Fox cast in terms of charm, they do an admirable job of giving Fox and company some new faces to interact with. Starlink may not be a Star Fox game, and it may not be a proper replacement for a real Star Fox game, but it makes me hopeful for the series' future by being the best use of the IP that we have seen in well over a decade. And I really don't think that that is a controversial opinion.